Hello, welcome back. So glad you're with me again. I do enjoy these evening sessions with you, reading the story of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And it just gets more and more exciting, doesn't it? Do you remember in our last chapter how Lucy has been coerced, you might say, into going upstairs and looking in that magician's book to see if she can find a spell that'll take away invisibility? Because there are these strange people thumping around on the island where they are. They can't see them, but they sure do make a lot of noise. And they must be jumping high because remember when they served the food was down at our level, and then the next minute it was up 15 feet high. Boing, boing, boing. Wow. But she couldn't, and they couldn't see anything. So, do you remember the last words of the chapter we just finished, where Aslan had appeared in the room where she was reading that book and told her that it really wasn't very good that she was eavesdropping on her friends from school when she found a spell in the book that would let her listen to what her friends really thought of her. It was maybe better that she didn't even know. And now she believes him. But there was a beautiful story in the book, and now she can't remember much about it at all, except that it had a tree in it and a sword and a cup and a green hill, and that's all she can remember. And she says to Aslan at the end of the chapter, she said, "Will I ever be able to remember that story again? The one I couldn't remember? Will you tell it to me, Aslan?" And he says, "Indeed I will. I will tell it to you for years and years to come. But now we must meet the master of the house." Do you wonder what that wonderful story was that Lucy saw? A story that had a green hill in it and a tree and a sword and a cup? Does it make you think about the story of the Last Supper and the Lord's crucifixion? That's what I think about. And I think that there isn't another story in the whole world as more precious than that. Because when Jesus was sharing his last meal with his disciples and promising them that he would see them again and that he truly loved them, and then he died a death that he didn't deserve because he'd never done anything wrong, but he died to take the place of people like us who have done plenty of things wrong and offended our God. But he died in our place. And then we know that he came alive again, just like he did in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That white witch killed him, and then he came back to life again, and he's alive now. And that's the story that he's going to tell Lucy from now on. And there isn't another story, including these stories, that's as good as that one. Not good for our souls in the long run. I love that part. All right, now let's read about the Dufflepuds, whoever they are, but don't they sound like a bouncy people? I think they do. The Dufflepuds made happy. Lucy followed the great lion out into the passage, and at once she saw coming toward them an old man, barefoot and dressed in a red robe. His white hair was crowned with a circle of oak leaves, and his beard fell all the way down to his belt, and he supported himself on a curiously carved staff. And when he saw Aslan, he bowed low and said, "Welcome, sir, to the least of your houses." "Do you grow weary, Coryacan, of ruling such foolish subjects as I've given you here?" said Aslan. "No," said the magician, "they are very stupid, but there is no real harm in them. I begin to grow rather fond of the creatures. Sometimes, perhaps, I am a little impatient, waiting for the day when they can be governed by wisdom instead of this rough magic." "All in good time, Coryacan," said Aslan. "Yes, all in good time, sir," was the answer. "Do you intend to show yourself to them?" "No," said the lion, with a little half growl that meant, Lucy thought, the same thing as a laugh. "I would frighten them out of their senses. Many stars will grow old and come to take their rest in the islands before your people are ripe for that. And today, before sunset, I must visit Trumpkin the dwarf, where he sits in the castle of Paravel, counting the days until his master Caspian comes home. I will tell him all your story, Lucy. Don't look so sad. We will meet again." "Please, Aslan," said Lucy, "what do you mean by soon?" "I call all times soon," said Aslan, and instantly he vanished away. Lucy was alone with the magician. "Gone," he said. "And you and I are quite sad. It's always like that. You can't keep him. It's not as if he were a tame lion. And how did you enjoy my book?" "Parts of it very much indeed," said Lucy. "Did you know I was there all the time?" "Well, of course I knew when I let the duffers make themselves invisible that you would be coming along presently to take the spell off. I wasn't quite sure of the exact day, and I wasn't especially on watch this morning. You see, they had made me invisible too, and being invisible always makes me so sleepy. Hey-ho, there I am yawning again. Are you hungry?" "Well, perhaps I am a little. I have no idea what time it is." "Come on then," said the magician. "All times may be soon to Aslan, but in my home all hungry times are 1 o'clock." And he led her a little way down the passage and opened a door. And passing in, Lucy found herself in a room full of sunlight and flowers. The table was bare when they entered, but it was, of course, a magic table. And at a word from the old man, a tablecloth, silverware, plates, glasses, and food appeared. "I hope this is what you would like," he said. "I have tried to give you food more like the food of your own land, and than perhaps you have had lately." "It's lovely," said Lucy, and indeed it was. An egg omelette, piping hot, cold lamb and green peas, strawberry ice cream, lemonade to drink, and a cup of hot chocolate to follow. But the magician himself drank only wine and ate only bread. There was nothing alarming about him, and Lucy and he were soon chatting away like old friends. "When will the spell work?" said Lucy. "Will the duffers be visible once again?" "Oh, yes, they're visible now, but they're probably all asleep still. They always take a rest in the middle of the day." "And now that they're visible, are you going to let them off being ugly? Will you make them as they were before?" "Well, that is rather a delicate question," said the magician. "You see, it's only they who think they were so nice looking before. They think that they've been uglified, but that's not what I called it. Many people might even say it was a change for the better." "Are they awfully conceited then?" said Lucy. "They are, or at least the chief duffer is, and he's taught all the rest to be too. They always believe every word he says." "We've noticed that," said Lucy. "Yes, well, we'd be better getting on without him. In a way, of course, I could turn him into something else, or even put a spell on him which would make them not believe a word he said, but I don't like to do that. It's better for them to admire him than admire nobody." "Oh, don't they admire you?" said Lucy. "Oh, not me," said the magician. "They wouldn't admire me." "Well, what was it you uglified him for? I mean, what they called uglified." "Well, they wouldn't do what they were told. Their work is to mind the garden and raise food. Not for me, as they imagine, but for themselves. And they wouldn't do it at all if I didn't make them. And of course, for a garden, you need water. There's a beautiful spring about half a mile up the hill. And from that spring there flows a stream which comes right past the garden. All I asked them to do was to take their water from the stream instead of trudging up to the spring with their buckets 2 or 3 times a day and terribly tiring themselves out and spilling half of it on the way back. But they couldn't see that. And in the end, they refused, point blank." "Are they as stupid as all that?" said Lucy. The magician sighed. "You would believe the troubles I've had with them. A few months ago, they were all for washing up the plates and knives before dinner. They said it saved time afterwards. And I've caught them planting boiled potatoes to save cooking them when they dug them up. One day the cat got into the dairy, and 20 of them are at work moving the milk out. Nobody thought of moving the cat. But I see you finished your dinner. Let's go and look at the duffers, now that they can be looked at." And they went into another room, which was full of polished instruments, hard to understand, such as astrolabes and orreries and coronoscopes and posimeters and choriambuses and theolidids. And here and then, there, when they came to the window, the magician said, "Look, there are your duffers." I don't see anybody, said Lucy, but what are those mushroom things? The things she pointed at were dotted all over the level grass, and they certainly did look like mushrooms, but far too big. The stalks were about 3 feet high, and the umbrellas were about the same width from edge to edge. When she looked carefully, she noticed too that the stalks joined the umbrellas not in the middle, but at one side, which gave an unbalanced look to them. And there was something, a sort of little bundle, lying on the grass at the foot of each stalk. In fact, the longer she gazed at them, the less like mushrooms they looked. The umbrella part was not really round, as she had first thought. It was longer than it was broad and widened at one end, and there were a great many of them, 50 or more. And here's a picture of them. Strange-looking creatures, aren't they? The clock struck 3, and instantly a most extraordinary thing happened. Each of the mushrooms suddenly turned upside down. The little bundles which had laid at the bottom of the stalks were heads and bodies. The stalks themselves were legs, but not 2 legs to each body. Each body had one single, thick leg right under it, and not to one side like the leg of a one-legged man. And at the end of it, a single enormous foot, a broad-toed foot with the toes curling up a little so that it looked rather like a small canoe. She saw in a moment why they had looked like mushrooms. They had been lying flat on their backs, with each straight leg straight up in the air and its enormous foot spread out above it. She learned afterwards that this was their ordinary way of resting, for the foot kept off the rain and the sun. And for a monopod to lie under its own foot is almost as good a thing as being in a tent. Oh, they're so funny, said Lucy, bursting into laughter. Did you make them like that? Yes, I made the duffers into monopods, said the magician. He, too, was laughing, till tears ran down his cheeks. But watch, he added, and it was worth watching. Of course, these little one-footed men couldn't walk or run as we do. They got about by jumping, like fleas or frogs. And what jump they made, as if each big foot was a mass of springs. And with a bounce they came down, and that's what made the thumping noise yesterday. For now they were jumping around in all directions and calling out to one another, "Hey, lads, we're visible again!" "Visible we are," said one in a tassel red cap, who was obviously the chief. "And what I say is, when chaps are visible, why, they can see one another." "Ah, there it is, Chief," they all cried. "That's the point. Nobody's got a clearer head than you. You couldn't have made it plainer." "She caught the old man napping, that little girl did," said the chief monopod. "We've beaten him this time." "That's just what we were going to say ourselves," chimed the chorus. "You're getting stronger every day, Chief. Keep it up, keep it up." Here are the monopods all jumping around. "But do they dare talk about you like that?" Lucy said. "They seemed to be so afraid of you yesterday. Don't they know you might be listening?" "Well, that is the funny thing about dufflepuds," said the magician. "One minute they talk as if I ran everything and overheard everything and was extremely dangerous. And the next minute they think they can take me by tricks that a baby would see through, bless them." Will they have to be turned back into their proper shapes?" said Lucy. "Oh, I do hope it wouldn't be unkind to leave them as they are. Do they really mind very much? They seem pretty happy. I say, look at that jump. What were they like before?" "Oh, common little dwarfs," he said. "Nothing like as nice as the sort you have in Narnia." "Well, then it would be a pity to change them back," said Lucy. "They're so funny, and they're rather nice. Do you think it would make any difference if I told them that?" "I'm sure it would if you could ever get it into their heads." "Will you come with me and we can try?" No, you'll get on far better without me." "Thanks awfully for the lunch," said Lucy, and turned quickly away. She ran down the stairs, which she had come up so nervously that morning, and cannoned into Edmund at the bottom. All the others were waiting there for her, watching, and Lucy's conscience smote her when she saw their anxious faces and realized how long she had forgotten them. Everything's okay, she shouted. Everything's all right. The magician is a brick, and I've seen him, Aslan. After that, she went from them like the wind and out into the garden. Here the earth was shaking with jumps, and the air was ringing with the shouts of the monopods. Both were redoubled when they caught sight of her. Here she comes! Here she comes! They cried. 3 cheers for the little girl! Ah, she put it across the old gentleman properly, didn't she? And we're extremely regrettable, said the chief monopod, that we can't give you the pleasure of seeing us as we were before we were uglified, for you wouldn't believe the difference. And that's the truth, for there's no denying we're mortally ugly now, so we won't deceive you. Hey, that we are, chief. That we are, shouted the others, bouncing like so many balloons. You said it all. But I don't think you're ugly at all, said Lucy, shouting to make herself heard. I think you look very nice. Hear her, said the monopod. True for you, missy. Very nice we look. You couldn't find a handsomer lot. And they said this without any surprise and didn't seem to notice that they had changed their minds. She's a saying, replied the chief monopod, as how we looked very nice before we were uglified. True for you, chief, true for you, chanted the others. We heard her ourselves. I did not, yelped Lucy. I said you were very nice now. So she did, said the chief monopod. She said we were very nice then. Hear them both, said the monopods. There's a pair for you, always right. They couldn't have put it better. But I'm just saying the opposite, said Lucy, stamping her foot with impatience. So you are, said the monopod. Nothing like the opposite. Keep it up, both of you. You are enough to drive anyone mad, said Lucy, and gave up. But the monopods seemed perfectly contented, and she decided that on the whole, the conversation had been a success. And before everyone went to bed that evening, something else happened, which made them even more satisfied with their one-legged condition. Caspian and all the Narnians went back as soon as possible to the shore to send word to Rince and the others on board the Dawn Treader, who were by now very anxious. And of course, the monopods went with them, bouncing like footballs and agreeing with one another in loud voices until Eustace said, I wish the magician had made them inaudible instead of invisible. He was soon sorry that he'd said that, because then he had to explain that an inaudible thing is something you can't hear. And although that took a lot of trouble, and he was sure that the monopods never really understood it, what especially annoyed him was that they said in the end, but he can't put things the way our chief does. But you'll learn, young man, you'll learn. You listen to him. He'll show you things. There's a speaker for you. When they reached the bay, Reepicheep had a brilliant idea. He had his little coracle, lowered and paddled himself in it until the monopods were thoroughly interested. And then he stood up in it and he said, Worthy and intelligent monopods, you do not need boats. Each of you has a foot that will do just as well. Jump as lightly as you can into the water and see what happens. The chief monopod hung back and warned the others that they would find the water extremely wet. But one or two of the younger ones tried it almost at once, and then a few others followed their example, and at last the whole lot did the same. It worked perfectly. The huge single foot of a monopod acted like a raft or a boat. And when Reepicheep had taught them how to cut a rude paddle for themselves, they all paddled about the bay and around the Dawn Treader, looking for all the world like a fleet of little canoes with a fat dwarf standing in it. And they had races, and bottles of wine were lowered down to them from the ship as prizes, and the sailors stood leaning over the ship's sides and laughed until their own sides ached. The duffers were also very pleased with their new name of monopod, which seemed to them a magnificent name, although they had a hard time getting it right. That's what we are, they bellowed. Moneypods, pomopods, podimons, just what was on the tip of our tongue to call ourselves all the time. But they soon got mixed up with their old names of duffers, and they finally settled on calling themselves the Dufflepuds. And that's what they will probably be calling themselves for centuries. That evening, all the Narnians dined upstairs with the magician. And Lucy noticed how different the whole top floor looked now that she was no longer afraid of it. The mysterious signs on the doors were still mysterious, but now they looked as if they had kind and cheerful meanings, and even that bearded mirror seemed now rather funny. At dinner, everyone had, by magic, what everyone liked best to eat and drink. And after dinner, the magician did a very useful and beautiful piece of music. He laid 2 blank sheets of parchment on the table and asked Drinian to give him an exact account of their voyage up to date. And as Drinian spoke, everything he described came out on the parchment in fine, clear lines, until at last each sheet was a splendid map of the eastern oceans, showing Galma, Terabithia, the 7 islands, the Lone Islands, Dragon Island, Burnt Island, Deathwater, and now the land of the Duffers itself, all exactly the right sizes and in the right positions. These were the first maps ever made of those seas, and better than any that have been made since without magic. For on these, though towns and mountains looked at first just like they would on an ordinary map, when the magician lent them his magnifying glass, you saw that they were perfect little pictures of the real thing, so that you could see the very streets and the slave market at Narrowhaven, all very clear and very distant, like things through the wrong end of a telescope. The only drawback was that the coastline of most of the islands was incomplete, for the map only showed what Drinian had seen with his own eyes. When they were finished, the magician kept one for himself and presented the other one to King Caspian, and it now hangs in his chamber of instruments at Cair Paravel. But the magician could tell them nothing about lands or seas further east. He did, however, tell them that about 7 years before that, a Narnian ship had called in his island, and she had on board the lords Revilian, Argos, Mamravon, and Roop. So they judged that the golden man they had seen lying in Deathwater must be Lord Restamar. The next day, the magician magically mended the stern of the Dawn Treader, where it had been damaged by the sea serpent, and loaded her with useful gifts. There was a most friendly parting, and when she sailed, 2 hours after noon, all the Dufflepuds paddled out to her to the harbor mouth and cheered until she was out of sound of their cheering. And that's the end of chapter 11. And now we come to a scary one. Scary for me. Maybe not for you. The Dark Island. After this adventure, they sailed on south and a little east for 12 days with a gentle wind, the skies being mostly clear and the air warm. There were no fish or birds, except that once there were whales spotted a long ways to the starboard. Lucy and Reepicheep played a good deal of chess at this time. Then, on the 13th day, Edmund, up in the mast, sighted what looked like a great dark mountain rising out of the sea on their port bow. They altered course and made for this land, mostly by oar, for the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. When evening fell, they were still a long way from it, and so they rowed all night. Next morning, the weather was fair, but a flat calm with no wind. The dark mass still lay ahead, much nearer and larger, but still very dim, so they still thought it was a long way off, and others thought they were just running into a mist. About 9 that morning, very suddenly, it was so close that they could see that it was not land at all, or even, in the ordinary sense, a mist. It was darkness. It's rather hard to describe, but you will see what it's like if you imagine yourself looking into the mouth of a railway tunnel, a tunnel either so long or so twisty that you can't see the light at the other end. And then you know what it would be like. For a few feet, you could see the rails and the gravel in broad daylight, and then there would come a place where it looked like they were in twilight, and then pretty soon, without a sharp dividing line, they would vanish altogether into smooth black darkness. And it was just like that here. For a few feet in front of their bows, they could see the swell of the bright blue-green water. Beyond that, they could see the water looking pale and gray as it might late in the evening. But beyond that, utter blackness, as if they had come to the edge of a moonless and a starless night. Caspian shouted to his sailors to keep her back, and all except the rowers rushed forward and gazed from the bows. But there was nothing to be seen from gazing. Behind them was the sea and the sun, and before them the darkness. "Do we go into this?" said Caspian after a while. "Not by my advice," said Drinian. "The captain's right," said several sailors. "I almost think he is," said Edmund. Lucy and Eustace didn't speak, but they felt very glad inside at the turn things seemed to be taking. Here we are. But all at once, the clear voice of Reepicheep broke the silence. "And why not?" he said. "Will someone explain to me why not?" No one was anxious to explain, so Reepicheep continued. "If I were addressing peasants or slaves," he said, "I might suppose that this suggestion proceeded from cowardice. But I hope that it will never be told in Narnia that a company of noble and royal persons in the flower of their age turned tail because they were afraid of the dark." "But what manner of use would it be to plough through the dark?" asked Drinian. "Use?" replied Reepicheep. "Use, Captain? If by use you mean filling our bellies or our purses, I confess that it will be no use at all. So far as we know, we did not set sail to look for things that are useful, but to seek honor and adventure. And here is as great an adventure as I ever heard of, and if we turn back, it'll be an impeachment on our honor." Several of the sailors said things under their breath that sounded like "honor be blowed," but Caspian said, "Oh, bother you, Reepicheep. I almost wish we'd left you at home." "All right. If you put it that way, I suppose we shall have to go on. Unless Lucy would rather not." Lucy felt that she would indeed rather not, but what she said out loud was, "I'm game." "Your Majesty will at least order the lights to be lit?" said Drinian. "By all means," said Caspian. "See to it, Captain." So the lanterns at the stern and the prow and the masthead were all lit, and Drinian ordered 2 torches amidships. Pale and feeble they looked in the sunshine. Then all the men, except some who were left below at the oars, were ordered on deck and fully armed and posted in their battle stations with their swords drawn. Lucy and the 2 archers were posted up in the masts with their bows bent and arrows on the string. Rheinelf was in the bows with his line ready to take soundings to see how deep the water was. And Eustace, Reepicheep, Edmund, and Caspian were glittering in their armor with him. And Drinian was at the back, at the tiller, steering the ship. "And now, in Aslan's name, forward!" cried Caspian. "A slow, steady stroke, and let every man be quiet and keep his ears open for orders." With a creak and a groan, the Dawn Treader started to creep forward as the men began to row. Lucy, up in the fighting top, up in the mast, had a wonderful view of the exact moment when they entered the darkness. The bow had already disappeared before the sunlight had left the stern. She saw it go, and 1 minute the golden stern, the blue sky, and the blue sea and the sky were all in broad daylight. The next minute the sea and the sky had vanished. The lantern in the stern, which they had hardly noticed before, was the only thing to show where the end of the ship was. In front of the lantern, she could see the black shape of Drinian crouched over the tiller, and down below her the 2 torches were made visible 2 small patches of the deck, and gleamed on the swords and the helmets of the soldiers. And forward there was another island of light on the forecastle. Apart from that, the fighting top, lit by the masthead light which was just above her, seemed to be a little lighted world of its own, floating in lonely darkness. And the lights themselves, as always happens with lights when you have to have them at the wrong time of the day, looked lurid and unnatural. She also noted that she was very cold. How long this voyage into the darkness lasted, nobody knew. Except for the creak of the rowlocks and the splash of the oars, there was nothing to show that they were moving at all. Edmund, peering from the bows, could see nothing except the reflection of the lantern in the water ahead of him. It was a greasy sort of reflection, and the ripple made by their advancing prow appeared to be heavy and small and lifeless. As time went on, everyone except the rowers began to shiver with the cold. Suddenly, from somewhere, no one's sense of direction was very clear right now, there came a cry, either some inhuman voice, or else the voice of one in such extremity of terror that he had almost lost his humanity. Caspian was still trying to speak. His mouth was too dry, when the shrill voice of Reepicheep, which sounded louder in this silence, was heard. "Who calls?" he piped. "If you are a foe, we do not fear you, and if you are a friend, your enemies shall be taught to fear us." "Mercy!" cried the voice. "Mercy! Even if you're only one more dream, have mercy! Take me on board! Take me, even if it's only to strike me dead! But in the name of all mercies, do not fade away and leave me in this horrible land!" "Where are you?" shouted Caspian. "Come aboard and welcome." There came another cry, whether of joy or terror, and then they knew that someone was swimming toward them. "Stand by to heave him up, men," said Caspian. "Aye, aye, your majesty," said the sailors, and several crowded to the port bulwark with ropes, and one, leaning far out over the side, held a torch. A wild white face appeared in the blackness of the water, and then, after some scrambling and pulling, a dozen friendly hands had the stranger on board. Edmund thought he had never seen a wilder-looking man. Though he did not otherwise look very old, his hair was an untidy mop of white. His face was thin and pinched, and for clothing only a few wet rags hung about him. But what one mainly noticed was his eyes, which were so wide opened as to seem to have no eyelids at all, and they stared of pure fear. The moment his feet reached the deck, he said, "Fly, fly, turn around your ship and fly. Row for your lives away from this accursed shore." "Compose yourself," said Reepicheep, "and tell us what the danger is. We are not used to flying." The stranger started horribly at the voice of the mouse, which he had not noticed before. "Nevertheless, you will fly from here," he gasped. "This is the island where dreams come true." "That's the island I've been looking for a long time," said one of the sailors. "I reckon I'd find I was married to Nancy if we landed here." "And I'd find my Tom alive again," said another. "Oh, you fools," said the man, stamping his foot with rage. "That's the sort of talk that brought me here. And I'd better have drowned or never been born. Do you hear what I say? This is where dreams, do you understand, come to life. Not daydreams, real dreams." There was about half a minute's silence, and then, with a great clatter of armor, the whole crew were tumbling down the main hatch as quick as they could, flinging themselves onto the oars to row as they had never rowed before. And Drinian was swinging the tiller around, and the bosun was giving out the quickest stroke that had ever been heard before. The bosun is the one who calls to the men to row so that they're all rowing at the same time, and he was getting them to row faster than anybody had ever rowed before. For it had all taken people only about half a minute to remember certain dreams that they had, dreams that made you afraid of going to sleep again, and to realize what it might mean to live in a land where those dreams came true. Only Reepicheep remained unmoved. Your Majesty, are you going to tolerate this mutiny? This is a panic. This is a rout." "Row, row," bellowed Caspian. "Pull for all your lives. Are you going in the right direction, Drinian?" "You can say what you like, Reepicheep. There are some things no man can face." "Well, then it is my good fortune not to be a man," replied Reepicheep with a very stiff bow. Lucy from up aloft had heard it all, and in an instant one of her dreams that she had and that she'd been trying very hard to forget came back to her as vividly as she had just woken up from it. So that was what was behind them on the island in that darkness. For a second she wanted to go down and be with Edmund and Caspian, but what use? If dreams began coming true, Edmund and Caspian themselves might turn into something horrible just as she reached them. She gripped the rail of the fighting top and tried to steady herself. They were rowing back to the light as hard as they could. It would be all right in a few minutes, but oh, if only it could be right now. Though the rowing made a good deal of noise, it did not conceal the total silence which surrounded the ship. Everyone knew it would be better not to listen, not to strain his ears for any sound in that darkness, but everybody had to listen, and soon everybody was hearing things, and each one heard something different. Do you hear a noise like a huge pair of scissors opening and shutting over there? Eustace asked Rheinelf. Hush, said Rheinelf. I can hear them crawling up the sides of the ship. It's going to land on the mast, said Caspian. Ah, said the sailor, there are the gongs beginning. I knew they would. Caspian, trying not to look at anything, especially not to look behind him, went back to where Drinian was. Drinian, he said, in a low voice, how long did it take us to row in here? I mean, rowing to when we picked up that stranger. 5 minutes, perhaps, said Drinian. Why? Because we've been way more than that trying to get out. Drinian's hand shook on the tiller, and a line of cold sweat poured down his face. The same idea was occurring to everyone on board. We'll never get out, moaned the rowers. He's steering us all wrong. We're going round and round in circles. We'll never get out. The stranger, who had been lying in a huddled heap on the deck, sat out and burst into a horrible screaming laugh. Never get out, he yelled. That's it, of course. We'll never get out. What a fool I was to have thought they'd let me go as easily as that. No, it's true. We'll never get out. Lucy leaned her head on the edge of the fighting top and whispered, Aslan, if you ever loved us, please help us now. The darkness did not grow any less, but she began to feel a very little bit better. After all, nothing really bad has happened to us yet, she thought. Look, cried Rheinelf's voice hoarsely from the bows. There was a tiny speck ahead. And then while they watched, a broad beam of light fell as if from heaven upon the ship. It did not alter the surrounding darkness, but the whole ship was lit up by it, as if by a searchlight. Caspian blinked, stared around, and saw the faces of his companions, all with wild, fixed expressions. Everyone was staring in the same direction. Behind them lay his black, sharply edged shadow. Lucy looked along the beam where she was standing and presently saw something in it. At first it looked like a cross, and then it looked like an airplane, and then it looked like a kite, and then with a whirring of wings it was right overhead, and it was an albatross. That's an enormously huge seagull. They have wings that are, are they 12 feet across? Anyway, they're enormous birds. They can fly for days and never land. Anyway, she saw an albatross. It circled 3 times around the mast and then perched for an instant on the crest of the gilded dragon at the prow, and it called out in a strange, sweet voice what seemed to be words, although no one understood them. And after that, it spread its wings, rose, and began to fly slowly ahead, bearing a little to the starboard. Drinian steered right after it, not doubting that it offered good guidance. But no one except Lucy knew that as it circled the mast, it had whispered to her, Courage, dear heart. And the voice she felt sure was Aslan's. And with the voice, a delicious smell breathed in her face. In a few minutes, the darkness had turned into grayness ahead. And then, almost before they dared to be hoping, they had shot out into the sunlight again. And they were in the warm blue world again. And all at once, everyone began to realize that there was nothing to be afraid of and never had been. They blinked their eyes and looked around. The brightness of the ship itself astonished them. They had half expected that the darkness would cling to the white and green and the gold in some form of grime or scum. And then first one and then another began to laugh. I reckon we've made big fools of ourselves, said Rheinelf. Lucy lost no time coming down to the deck, where she found the others all gathered around the newcomer. For a long time, he was too happy to speak. And he could only gaze at the sea and the sun and feel the sides of the ship and the ropes as if to make sure he was really awake, while tears rolled down his cheeks. Thank you, he said at last. You have saved me from, but we won't talk about that. And now, let me know who you are. I am a Telmarine of Narnia, and when I was worth anything, men called me the Lord Roop. And I, said Caspian, am Caspian, king of Narnia, and I sailed to find you and your companions who were my father's friends. Lord Roop fell on his knees and kissed the king's hand. Sire, he said, you are the man in all the world I most wish to see. Please grant me a boon. What is it? Said Caspian. Never bring me back there, he said. He pointed back, and they looked. But all they saw was the bright blue sea and the bright blue sky. The dark island had vanished, and it had vanished forever. Why, said the Lord Rube, you have destroyed it. I don't think it was us, said Lucy. Sire, said Drinian, the wind is fair for the southeast. Shall I have our poor fellows set up and sail? After that, any man who could be spared, go and lie down and sleep in your hammocks. Yes, said Caspian, and let's have a drink all around. I feel like I could sleep around the clock myself. So all afternoon, with great joy, they sailed southeast with a fair wind, but nobody noticed when the albatross had disappeared. What a beautiful story. And what a beautiful story about how when we cry out to Jesus, he will come and help us, even if we're in a ship in the middle of the sea, because he is everywhere and his ears are always open to us when we pray to him. Isn't that a wonderful thought? Well, please come back next time and join me for chapters 13 and 14. The Three Sleepers is the title of the next chapter. That'll be a good one, I've no doubt. Bye for now, everybody. I've really enjoyed being with you. I hope you're enjoying this too. Bye for now.